Welcome back to Dark Ascent. I'm Matthew. In today's video, I'm covering 3 gym guys who thought Everest was just a big hike and froze to death. They thought being in the best shape of their lives was their biggest advantage up there. By the end of the climb, they were too exhausted to save themselves. It was May 18, 2017. Summit season on Everest was at its peak, and climbers crowded the southeast ridge, waiting for a narrow weather window. Temperatures above 26,000 feet dropped below 25 degrees. Wind pushed loose snow across the fixed rope lines. From lower on the mountain, the line of headlamps moving upward looked almost calm. But once climbers entered the death zone, almost everybody up there was struggling, whether they admitted it or not. Chad Walker was 30 years old, a fitness coach from Utah. Luke Keaton, 31, worked as a personal trainer and former amateur wrestler. Cameron Ford, 29, worked at construction and competed in endurance races during the off-season. The 3 had gained a small following online by posting fitness challenges, mountain training, and endurance-focused content. Their social media presence was built on a simple message: hard work beats everything. Suffer more than the next guy. Push through the pain. Their content showed ice baths at 5 a.m., weighted stair climbs, mountain trail sprints, and recovery metrics posted like athletic scorecards. They were the kind of guys their followers looked at and thought, if anyone can do this, it's them. Before Everest, they had completed guided climbs on Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua, along with winter mountaineering courses in Colorado. They spent months training for the expedition through strength workouts, long stair sessions with weighted pack, altitude mask, conditioning, and strict meal plans. Together, they spent nearly $80,000 preparing for the climb with professional gear, oxygen systems, expedition support, and custom cold weather equipment. The problem wasn't that they failed to prepare. The problem was they trained for Everest like it was an athletic challenge instead of a survival environment. Chad, Luke, and Cameron were climbing with a commercial expedition, supported by Sherpa guides and the fixed rope infrastructure that most South Col summit attempts rely on. The structure gave them experienced support on the mountain, but it also gave them another reason not to worry. Commercial expeditions have made Everest more accessible than it was a generation ago, but accessible doesn't mean safe. The 3 arrived at base camp as a unit, but the mountain exposed them as individuals, and each one cracked differently. Chad's problem was control. He was the de facto leader of the group, and he processed the altitude the way he processed everything, as a management problem. When his body gave him bad information, he overrode it with logic. When a Sherpa told him the group needed more rest, Chad filed it away as a difference of opinion rather than expert advice. He wasn't reckless. He was methodical about the wrong things. He tracked metrics, built schedules, and kept morale high with exactly the kind of thinking that works at sea level and kills you at 28,000 feet. Luke's problem was attention. He was the most technically careful of the 3 under normal conditions, obsessive about gear checks, oxygen saturation readings, recovery data. But hypoxia specifically degrades the kind of focused, sequential thinking that careful technical work requires. The mountain targeted the thing Luke relied on most. By summit day, the same hands that had clipped and unclipped safety lines hundreds of times during the expedition were fumbling the same motions twice, then stopping to stare at hardware he'd used without thinking for 2 months. His brain had turned his greatest strength into a liability. Cameron's problem was physical. He was probably the strongest of the 3 at lower elevations. He handled load carries better than anyone nearby and almost never complained. But raw physical capacity adapts to altitude differently than cardiovascular fitness, and Cameron's body responded worse than the others as elevation increased. He kept interpreting exhaustion as a temporary state rather than a signal. He had spent years training himself to push through discomfort. Everest gave him discomfort. He was physically incapable of pushing through, and the training made him slow to recognize the difference. Understanding those 3 failure patterns matters, because on the descent, each man deteriorated in exactly the way the mountain had been telegraphing for weeks. At base camp, the 3 quickly became known for their energy. While most climbers rested during acclimatization days, Chad organized group gear sessions and kept morale high with commentary about discipline and delayed gratification. Luke tracked calorie intake, oxygen saturation, resting heart rate, and recovery metrics on his watch, and shared daily summaries with the others. Cameron volunteered to carry heavier loads between camps because he genuinely believed suffering at lower altitude translated directly into performance higher up. A lot of first-time Everest climbers believe being in great shape is enough to handle most of the mountain's dangers. Early in the expedition, Chad, Luke, and Cameron looked stronger than almost everyone around them. During their first acclimatization rotation through the Khumbu icefall, they crossed aluminum stone ladders suspended over deep crevasses with confidence, while many other climbers moved slowly and cautiously across them, one careful step at a time. The icefall did what it always does to fit confident climbers. It confirmed everything they already believed about themselves. They moved through it faster than most, and that speed felt like evidence. It wasn't. The icefall is technical and dangerous, but it doesn't tell you anything about what your body will do above 26,000 feet. The climbers who moved slowly through it that morning weren't weaker. They were conserving something Chad, Luke, and Cameron were already spending. Chad hated slow movement. Whenever traffic opened ahead of him, he pushed forward aggressively instead of settling into the steady, deliberate pacing that experienced climbers practice almost obsessively at altitude. Luke joked that the climb felt like Zone 2 cardio near Camp 2 and laughed about how much older climbers prioritized recovery days. Cameron was quietly dealing with the first signs that his body was adapting worse than he expected. He just didn't say anything about it. By the second acclimatization rotation above Camp 2, warning signs had already started appearing. Nothing dramatic, just small problems stacking together. Cameron sweating excessively during climbs, despite freezing temperatures. Luke repeatedly removing gloves too long while adjusting gear because he hated losing dexterity. Chad trying to maintain pace uphill instead of conserving energy during steeper sections. Experienced climbers noticed the difference immediately. The three looked strong while moving, but their recovery after reaching camp looked poor compared to climbers who were pacing themselves more carefully. At Camp 2, while other climbers spent afternoons resting quietly inside tents, Chad organized equipment checks and kept the group in planning mode rather than recovery mode. Luke filmed short clips about discipline. Cameron quietly struggled to eat because his appetite had started declining, a known warning sign at altitude that he attributed to adjusting to the food. Acclimatization rotations exist for one reason: to force the body to produce more red blood cells before the real climb begins. Climbers go up, stress the system, come back down to recover, then go higher. Done properly, it's the closest thing the body has to genuine preparation for the death zone. Done impatiently, rushed, shortened, interrupted by extra load carries, it leaves far less reserve than it appears to. Chad, Luke, and Cameron completed the rotations. They just didn't treat them as the serious work they were. Above 21,000 feet, sleep became difficult for all three, but differently. Luke started waking repeatedly during the night, gasping for air, his body struggling to pull in enough oxygen, even while lying still. Cameron lost his appetite almost completely and forced himself to eat because guides kept warning climbers about the calorie deficits that accelerate deterioration at altitude. Chad physically handled the early altitude better, but he processed exhaustion as a mental obstacle rather than a physiological one. When his body told him to stop, he told himself that was what the training was for. During another acclimatization rotation toward Camp 3, Chad repeatedly shortened rest breaks because he believed stopping too long broke rhythm and killed momentum. Cameron carried extra camera gear higher on the route because he calculated the weight difference as negligible. Luke was meticulous about his oxygen saturation readings, but interpreted declining numbers as temporary rather than cumulative at sea level. Those were the habits that made them good at what they did. At 24,000 feet, everything matters. By then, Luke was getting headaches almost every day above camp. Cameron looked more exhausted after each rotation, and other climbers had started noticing Chad breathing hard, even while standing still. One of the expedition's Sherpa guides pulled Chad aside after the Camp 3 rotation and told him directly that the group needed more rest days before attempting the summit. That pushing harder at altitude wasn't the same as pushing harder at sea level. Chad listened carefully, said the group felt strong, and told him they'd been building toward this for 2 years. He nodded, said they'd reassess in the morning, and walked back to his tent. The guide didn't follow. On Everest, you can tell someone the truth, and they can choose not to hear it. And there is nothing left to do after that. The days between the Camp 3 rotation and the summit push were the quietest of the expedition. Most climbers used them to rest, eat, and sleep as much as the altitude allowed. Chad used them to prepare. He reviewed oxygen flow rates, confirmed gear configurations, and kept the group mentally locked in on the window. To anyone watching, it looked like focus. It was also the last opportunity to honestly assess whether they were ready, and nobody took it. When the forecast finally came through, Chad read it twice and sat quietly for a moment. Then he told the others they were going. Everyone seemed to know what the answer would be before he said it. Cameron nodded. Luke started going through his gear, and within minutes they were preparing for the climb. After 2 years of planning and training, the decision itself was surprisingly simple. By mid-May, weather forecasts finally opened a narrow summit window. Expeditions throughout the mountain began preparing for summit attempts. Camp 4 on the South Col filled with climbers, sorting oxygen systems, melting snow for water, and trying unsuccessfully to rest before departure. Camp 4 sits at roughly 26,000 feet. Even resting there feels horrible. People cough constantly because the air is painfully dry and cold. Oxygen masks hiss softly in dark tents all night while wind slams against fabric walls hard enough to shake entire campsites. Boots freeze solid outside sleeping bags. Most climbers barely sleep at all. Chad kept morale high that evening. He reminded the group what they'd invested to get here. It was exactly the kind of thing that sounds like leadership in a gym locker room and sounds like a warning sign at 26,000 feet. By then, the mountain had already worn them down badly. Luke forced himself to eat before departure because nausea had been building for days. Cameron sat breathing heavily while organizing oxygen cylinders. His rest heart rate, if he checked it, would have told him something his mind was refusing to process. Chad moved constantly around camp despite obvious exhaustion, running the same mental override he'd been running for weeks. Nobody slept much before the summit push. Cameron lay still inside his sleeping bag and noticed his legs were already cramping. He hadn't even started climbing yet. Luke checked his oxygen regulator twice before putting it down, picked it up and checked it again. Not because he suspected a problem, but because checking things was the only thing that still felt like control. Chad stared at the tent fabric and thought about the plan. The plan was solid. The plan had always been solid. That's the last thing he was certain of before the alarm went off. At approximately 9:30 p.m. on May 18th, the three left Camp 4 with their climbing team. Temperature outside hit roughly 30-degree Fahrenheit with wind chill before midnight. Every breath through the oxygen masks sounded mechanical, rhythmic, like something running on a timer, which in a sense, it was. Each oxygen cylinder carried roughly 8 to 10 hours of supply at standard summit flow rates. The clock had been running since the moment they left camp. The climb immediately slowed everyone into a long, single-file line, clipped into fixed ropes, running across steep ice and exposed rock. Climbers stopped every few steps just to catch their breath. Within the first hour above Camp 4, Cameron had already fallen behind the pace of the group. Chad stayed close to the fixed rope and kept glancing back. Luke moved steadily, but said nothing. The confidence of base camp was completely gone. Up here, there was only the rope, the next step, and the sound of their own breathing inside the masks. Around midnight, climbers approached the balcony at approximately 27,500 feet, the standard stop for oxygen cylinder exchanges. Traffic bottlenecks had already formed. Dozens of climbers stood clipped into ropes, waiting silently in freezing wind. Cameron sat through the oxygen change, longer than he should have. Chad got him back on his feet. Luke, struggling to reconnect a carabiner with stiffening fingers, clipped the same rope section twice before confirming it. It was a small mistake, but Everest accidents usually start with small mistakes piling up over time. Above the balcony, movement became slower and steeper toward the south summit. By approximately 3 a.m., early descending climbers were already warning about dangerous traffic higher on the ridge and discussing turnaround considerations. Chad's position on the summit timeline, they were close enough to continue. The south summit was visible. The actual summit was not. Between them sat the Hillary Step and several hundred more feet of exposed ridge. In the dark, with hypoxia narrowing everything down to the next few steps. That distance is almost impossible to judge accurately. Most serious mountaineers hold to a hard turnaround time, often around 1 p.m., after which they descend regardless of how close the summit appears. The rule exists because the summit is only half the climb. The longer climbers stay in the death zone, the harder the descent becomes. But turning around after years of preparation, $80,000 spent, and hours already climbing through darkness feels psychologically impossible. That's the trap, and the mountain doesn't care about any of it. The three reached the summit at approximately 11:20 a.m. on May 19th, more than an hour past the turnaround time most expedition guides were enforcing that season. The summit photos told their own story without narration. Ice-covered portions of masks and outer suits. Cameron sat directly in the snow, unable to remain standing, his head tilted slightly forward, chin toward his chest. Chad and Luke stood beside him. Nobody raised their arms. Nobody celebrated. They stayed on the summit for roughly 15 minutes. By the time descent began at approximately 11:35 a.m., they had already spent more than 14 hours above 26,000 feet. The climb down immediately felt worse. People assume the hard part is climbing upward, but descent begins when the body is already exhausted. dehydrated, and slowly shutting down. Hypoxia has been compounding for hours. Judgment is compromised in ways the climber cannot detect. The mind wanders, attention drifts, small errors accumulate. Traffic near the Hillary step created another bottleneck on the way down. Climbers moved through one at a time, while wind pushed hard across the exposed ridge. For someone still physically intact, the wait was miserable. For Chad, Luke, and Cameron, standing motionless in that wind, after 14 hours above 26,000 feet, it was the kind of delay the body doesn't come back from. Every minute spent standing still in that cold meant losing body heat that wouldn't come back, burning oxygen the cylinders couldn't replace, and draining energy the body had no way to restore. Chad kept pushing for urgency. Luke and Cameron slowed noticeably behind him. At 8,000 meters, determination can't make exhausted legs move any faster. Cameron deteriorated the way his body had been threatening to since Camp 3, suddenly and completely. Around 1:45 p.m., he sat beside the fixed rope line near the south summit and stayed there, not pausing to rest, just stopped, staring down slope. Each time Chad pulled him upright, Cameron walked a few steps and sat down again. His body had reached a threshold that no amount of will was going to move. Chad kept going back. The pattern repeated itself all afternoon. Cameron stopped, and Chad went back for him. The distance to Camp 4 never seemed to get any smaller. At some point, it became clear that Chad was spending energy faster than he could recover it, while Cameron was losing strength faster than Chad could help him regain it. The wind was picking up, and the light was beginning to fade. Chad either couldn't see what was happening, or couldn't bring himself to accept it. At 28,000 feet, those are often the same thing. Luke deteriorated differently. In the precise, technical way that hypoxia had been targeting all expedition, he would clip into a fixed rope section, pause, stare at the hardware, and clip again, not certain whether he'd done it correctly the first time. He removed his gloves to work the equipment, and then struggled to replace them. The careful, sequential thinking he relied on was the first thing the altitude had taken from him. Chad held together longest but deteriorated in the way his failure pattern always suggested, by not accepting what was in front of him. He kept telling Cameron they just needed to get lower. He kept telling Luke the body recovers fast once you descend. He probably believed it. The brain at that altitude reaches for the most optimistic explanation available. That's not weakness. It's what hypoxia does to a mind that has spent years training itself to override discomfort. Around 3 p.m., another descending climber noticed ice building heavily around Cameron's oxygen mask valve and stopped briefly to clear it. He urged all three men to keep moving downhill before continuing his own descent. Stopping in that wind costs body heat that cannot be replaced. At that altitude, people pass others who are dying and keep moving, not because they are indifferent, but because stopping means dying alongside them. By then, they were dehydrated badly. Water bottles had partially frozen. None of them had eaten properly for hours. Leg muscles cramped during descent while crampon points snagged fixed rope sections beneath drifting snow. Chad's relentlessness at altitude had never been theatrical. It was methodical, quiet, and persistent. At every stop on the descent, he climbed back toward Cameron, pulled him to his feet, and tried to get him moving downhill again. He kept his voice measured. He kept the plan simple. Reach Camp 4. He did this the same way he'd done everything else on the mountain, by turning the problem into a task and working the task. By mid-afternoon, Cameron could cover only a few feet at a time before sitting down. Luke was pausing at anchor points for minutes, at a stretch, staring down slope, the sequential logic of rope transitions no longer connecting reliably in his mind. GPS tracking data later showed all three were moving only intermittently through the afternoon, not resting, not advancing, just stopped. Radio calls from lower on the route reported 3 climbers stranded high above Camp 4. A rescue discussion began below, but climbers returning from their own summit pushes were already carrying limited oxygen reserves and had no realistic path back up into those conditions. All 3 were last confirmed above approximately 200 feet, roughly 800 vertical feet above Camp 4, between the south summit and the balcony. Cameron was beside the rope line. Luke was at a fixed anchor. Chad was still standing, still trying. The afternoon light changed. Temperature dropped sharply as the sun left the ridge. For a climber still moving, still generating body heat, it's survivable. For 3 men covering only a few feet at a time, stopping repeatedly in open wind, it was the mountain collecting on a debt that had been accumulating for weeks. The storm intensified through the evening. Visibility dropped behind blowing snow and cloud cover. The final confirmed data from GPS tracking showed faint movement high above camp shortly after sunset. After that, nothing. Through the night, the storm held. Climbers inside Camp 4 could hear the wind working across the upper ridge, a sustained, low roar that made conversation difficult even inside tents. Nobody moved upward. Nobody could. Search teams moved upward the following morning into clearing wind and low gray light. Cameron was found partially buried beside the rope route above Camp 4. Luke was discovered farther downslope, still clipped into a fixed safety line near an anchor. Chad was located several hundred feet uphill near exposed rock along the ridge. Recovered oxygen cylinders clarified what had happened. Each climber had started with 2 standard cylinders, roughly 8 to 10 hours of supply each at the flow rates the expedition had planned. The cylinders recovered showed no equipment failures, no valve malfunctions, no regulator damage. They simply ran low. The group had burned through oxygen faster than their timeline assumed, and they'd been on the mountain far longer than their cylinders were designed to cover. Some tanks came back nearly empty. The failure wasn't equipment, it was arithmetic. Too many hours at too high a flow rate, with no margin left for a descent that took far longer than planned. Medical findings concluded all 3 men died from hypoxia, hypothermia, and extreme exhaustion following prolonged exposure in the death zone. Frostbite injuries affected exposed portions of the face and hands. Investigators determined that severe overexertion earlier in the climb had accelerated oxygen depletion and physical deterioration during descent. The final report concluded that the group underestimated how differently Everest affects the human body compared to lower altitude endurance climbs. They all spent years training to reach the summit. They never realized getting down would be the real test.